Hello, and welcome to the Palantir podcast, the official recap of GHG Palantir online discussion groups, where we travel through the perilous realm together discussing Tolkien's work. We've moved on to The Hobbit, and in particular the first chapter, An Unexpected Party. Before we begin, there's some foundational topics to discuss. In particular, we can begin, as we do with The Lord of the Rings, with the first words from the author himself, in this case the author's note. What's of particular notice is that the very first sentence makes pains to note that this is a history, that this is something from the far past, that this isn't a story per se, that it is a history, that it is a recorded and reported history, something evident by the presence of the narrator throughout. Secondly, we have the nature of runes, which is interesting from the standpoint that at this point they are not the Cirth, they are English runes. And the question came up where this points. What does this indicate? Is this an indication of perhaps shorthand on Tolkien's part? Is it more a case perhaps of tying the story itself to England? The Hobbit itself occupies a strange place in Tolkien's legendarium. It was published in 1937, a little bit before On Fairy Stories, and after the initial larger and more complete draft of the Silmarillion, which came in around 1933, and before the stories of the Hobbits and the Silmarillion, the larger stories from the First Age, which Tolkien had been working on for the previous 2 decades, became tied together through the composition of The Lord of the Rings. Now, Tolkien admits in letters that his writing process, particularly with regards to The Lord of the Rings, but then also The Hobbit itself, is a process of discovery. We've discussed before when we went through the Silmarillion the fact that Tolkien likes to borrow elements of his stories, things that he likes, situations that seem most successful. And the question and the tension that's created with The Hobbit is whether or not these are intentional ties between, or whether it's more a case of borrowing, more a case of fear that a certain scenario would not see the light of day and be published for normal readership, and wanting to make sure that this is something that is visible and released to the world. We had discussed when we read as a group The Lord of the Rings that many of the significant passages from the Silmarillion, in particular the story of Beren and Luthien, are perhaps in the story specifically for this reason, a fear within Tolkien of whether or not these stories would ever be told or would ever be published. And it is a deep-seated desire to make sure that they were told at some point. The other curiosity here is the description of dwarvish maps, which he makes pains to explain have east pointing upwards. And as a group we discussed, what could this mean? Is it arbitrary? Is there a reason behind it? What could be to the east? Could this relate to the lunar or the solar cycle? It would seem to tie directly into the cycle of the moon, given that, especially in The Hobbit, there's so much emphasis given with the moon letters, and also with the harvest moon under Durin's Day, and then later with the Mines of Moria and Lord of the Rings and Ithilden, that the dwarves have some sort of affinity for the moon. Could it also have something to do with their origin story? One of the things that seems to be true from the Silmarillion is that the dwarves when they are discovered or when they are happened upon by the elves, are coming out of the mountains to the east. Now, granted, this is part of just the nature of the geography of Middle Earth, that where the elves have settled in Beleriand, of course, the dwarves are going to come from the east. What does this actually mean? One final way of looking at this, of understanding this, is to look specifically at what's included in the map that's given. And one of the glaring details that you'll see is that the Wood Elves' kingdom is shown at the very bottom of the page, and it is capped by the Lonely Mountain, thereby in some way indicating the quote-unquote supremacy over the dwarves, over the elves themselves, and perhaps putting in artistic or cartographic form the rivalry between the elves and dwarves. Perhaps. One of the things that The Hobbit in particular lends itself towards is a reading in line with on fairy stories. It's evident when you read The Hobbit itself that many of the ideas that Tolkien would espouse and develop into further clarity and perfect over the years are still being worked out, are still being tested in The Hobbit. It's arguable whether in the composition of that lecture or in the composition of The Hobbit, if the two ever really had any relationship to each other, if one led to the other, or if the two developed in some way in sequence together. But there are definitely elements that it's helpful to see, one of which is the idea of recovery, and the idea in particular of reflecting backwards the eucatastrophe and the end point. We know what comes later. We know how the story ends, and we know where it leads with The Lord of the Rings. The challenge with The Hobbit is to understand that The Hobbit came first, and The Lord of the Rings came after. The neat little bow that everything's tied together with, that makes sense of the linkages between The Hobbit and what came before with the developing Quenta Silmarillion, isn't there at this point. Technically, The Hobbit is a standalone and exists in a odd sort of limbo where you can look at it in multiple ways. You can look at it as a distinct narrative separate from Tolkien's other legendarium completely. And in some ways that may have been the intention when it was originally published. You can look at it in light of the Sill, which had been developed up to that point from the early 1930s, and also the Lays and the tales which came before, because that was all present in Tolkien's knowledge. So you could approach it from the standpoint of, well, what did Tolkien know in terms of the developing story at that point in its history? And then thirdly, you can look at it from the standpoint of the modern readership, who knows about The Lord of the Rings and who knows about the posthumously published Silmarillion and how all of these stories then fit together. The question is how we look at any one piece. And is it possible to retroactively look back in one way or another? It's one of the things that group discussion helps us achieve, is to be able to look at the multiple facets of the story itself. The Hobbit, in many ways, and An Unexpected Party in particular, act as foundation works to Tolkien's writing, particularly in terms of what came later. It was originally developed, at least so we believe, and as is discussed in John Rateliff's History of the Hobbit, that the Hobbit was conceived after its initial famous inscription on the exam booklet as stories which Tolkien told aloud to his children at bedtime, essentially. And it comes across in the clear and ever-present nature of the narrator. You also get a sense when reading The Hobbit that Tolkien is enjoying himself. He's having fun. He's throwing in the elements from the works that he studies as part of his career and the works that he loves, particularly Beowulf and the Eddas from Norse mythology, that he's pulling and borrowing elements from those works as well as his own mythologies and putting them together in new situations that he finds interesting. One of the things that we particularly discussed in this past meeting was the nature of the narrator, and in particular how the narrator has asides. One of the clearest examples of this is where the narrator, in the discussion of the dragon Smaug, talks about Smaug going out into the Valley of Dale to find maidens to eat. And this smacks of a certain amount of literary borrowing, of tropes from mythology as well as legend writing, as filler, like a there be dragon moment, of giving it the feel of these epic histories while telling its own story. Now, depending on the basis of where this comes from, as well as what form of study you use, this could mean any one of things. It could be simply a matter of Tolkien putting in extra flavor based on just fleshing out the story with these sort of tropes which fill in blanks that will actually be filled in later as he publishes further works. It could even be a way of linking it into a high epic tale-telling style, as opposed to giving a clear answer to anything. In a way, it also relates to Tolkien's use of what Tom Shippey refers to as interlacement in The Lord of the Rings, the layering of histories. And in this case, it's a layering of mythologies and perhaps even a subtle indication of the nature of the story itself, which is meant to be Bilbo's diary. Bilbo, of course, having never left the Shire, doesn't know about these things and only has tales to go on. One of the marvelous things, though, looking at this ambiguity and the quote-unquote holes that maybe are even here in terms of Tolkien's world building, is how much he is able to continue on from this point, building brick upon brick without really needing to go back and retcon. He only goes back and changes key passages in Riddles on the Dark, which we'll discuss in future chapters, but otherwise the rest of the novel remains intact. And yet, the firm edifice of all Middle-earth is built off of this work and then made more concrete in The Lord of the Rings. Now, granted, it is borrowing heavily from the Silmarillion, but at this point in Tolkien's life, he never thought the Silmarillion would be published. From here, after this sort of foundational discussion of some of the larger themes, we talked about two primary episodes in this chapter. The first is Bilbo's fit. He, of course, is surprised that Gandalf has come by and brought along 12 dwarves to his doorstep that he's never met before, and is thrust into the midst of an adventure he never asked for and doesn't want. And of course, as the dwarves, particularly Thorin, get into discussion of the nature of this adventure and the fact that he may never come home again, Bilbo has a fit. He starts shrieking and shaking, and then falls to the floor on his face, shouting, "Struck by lightning! Struck by lightning!" What on earth is going on with this hobbit? Well, to some degree, it's a battle inside him between his normal curiosity as well as his politeness, because any other sane person would never have let these dwarves into their home, whereas Bilbo is polite to a fault and lets all of them come in and feeds them all his food, emptying his pantry, and giving them his own meals. So there's that. But there's also the deep-seated and not yet woken adventuresomeness of his Tookish side, which there's a little bit of a battle going on, and granted the Tookish side doesn't really take part until following the bit. But up to this point, it's really almost as if Bilbo himself is the kettle, the tea kettle on the hearth. And up to this point, he's been putting up with everything out of pure politeness, until he cannot take any more, and the danger of it all essentially makes him explode. Following this episode, Gandalf lights the tip of his staff, which of course causes a blare of light, which in Bilbo's addled state he takes as being struck by lightning, and essentially is in a semi-catatonic state. It was too much pressure. It was too much ignoring fear, ignoring stress, ignoring the fact that he's in an absolutely absurd situation, completely outside of his normal daily life. Now, beyond this, we also had quite a bit of discussion with regards to the hoods which the dwarves wear and their coloring, which there's a couple of different things going on here. In particular, there seems to be familial relationships going on. You have Thorin and Sky Blue, with Fili and Kili in blue after him. Well, they're his sister sons. They're his nephews. You have Dori and Nori in purple. You have Bifur and Bofur in yellow. But then the other thing that could be going on here is, in addition to a familial bond shown by color, there's also potential for ranking. And then another interesting thing we discussed is that by nature of their hoods and the tribalism involved in that, there is a certain amount of either self-preservation or even militarism involved here, in the fact that by virtue of their hoods, by virtue of the colors ascribed to the various characters, the dwarves can know their fellows just by seeing them from behind, from the side, from above, from below. And in particular in a mine, and given the fact that almost every color is a bright color, perhaps with the exception of the dark green of Dwalin and the brown of Oin, that these would be very visible and would help with identification. Now, as we continue to discuss The Hobbit, we will continue to return to this chapter, as it is so foundational in the discovery of Bilbo as a person, as an adventurer, and then also as the foil for what Bilbo will become, as well as the foil for the relationship and the doubts of the dwarves towards Bilbo. One of the interesting things that we can see even now in the first chapter is how this story functions as a told narrative of perhaps a parent or an adult telling this story to a child, and the nuance that can come across based upon the adult knowledge versus the child's knowledge, and how there are inset jokes here to be found, as well as insights with regards to the very subtle nature of the shift and the evolution of the relationship between Bilbo and the dwarves, one which we will see that over time slowly grows into almost a parental guidance on the part of Bilbo, where Bilbo becomes by far the most responsible character, and making truth to Gandalf's prediction that Bilbo would be the right last member of the dwarves' party. Until next time, I hope you'll join us where we will be discussing